Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see people joining this webinar. We will just give people a few moments to get in via the electronic system and we will begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Karen Facey, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this afternoon's Real-World Evidence for Decisions webinar, Real-World Evidence over the Life Cycle of Advanced Therapeutic Medicinal Products to Meet the HTA regulation needs. And I'll be moderating this afternoon with Eric Sutherland, who's a senior health economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and who is a member of our steering group. We're excited to have a great panel for you to hear from this afternoon. We'll have a keynote speech from Ana Hildigo Simon, and then we will have a range of multi-stakeholder perspectives, and we'll introduce those speakers to you later. But if we move on to the next slide, what I'm going to do first is give you a little bit of housekeeping, just to say that this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available freely after the meeting in a few days. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please do use the Q&A function. We have plenty of time for interaction with the audience, so please do ask your questions. And if you can, rename yourself to add your affiliation so that we can see where you're coming from. And on the next slide, I'm just going to introduce Real-World Evidence for Decisions to you. We are a payer-led multi-stakeholder learning network, and we've really been brought together to address the excitement that there is with highly innovative technologies that we're now seeing coming into our healthcare systems, but recognizing that they often come with immature clinical evidence and high prices. So we want to know how we can best demonstrate the value of these technologies, and we are considering whether robust real-world evidence generated during the life cycle of a technology development and use could help resolve HTA payer uncertainties about the added value of these technologies. And we're always interested in understanding whether we can align individual payer requirements in one member state across other member states, and indeed outside Europe to other countries like Canada. We work on the principles of transparency and collaboration. And in our next slide, you'll see what we call our real-world evidence for decisions community. And many of you are on the line today. It's great to see you with us. We know that we engage with clinicians and registry holders, with patient representatives and patients themselves, with regulators, with analytical experts, with academia, with industry, and with public bodies, both HTA bodies and ministries, and organizations like the OECD. And we have an approach which is learning by doing, and this is very much guided by our steering committee, who you can see on our next slide. You'll see here that we are lucky to have a wide range of people from different countries, from different backgrounds, so HTA bodies, ministries of health, Eric Sutherland coming with us from the OECD, patient representatives, insurers, clinicians, analytic experts, academics, and people like myself who are general facilitators. And our work is sponsored by a range of pharmaceutical companies, including the Industry Association, UCOPE, and we're grateful for their support in what we do. But our work is all driven by this steering group, and it's them who said that this would be a good topic for a webinar and discussion today, because we all know that the HTA regulation is due to be operationalized in January 2025, which isn't far away now. So the question is, how will the advanced therapeutic medicinal products be evaluated? Is there a place for real-world evidence? That's what we'll be discussing today. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll be doing that in the context of everything we do in real-world evidence for decisions, where we recognize that it's challenging to develop robust real-world evidence. And that requires good data quality, availability, and governance. It requires sound methods, but it requires transparent consistency as well, and reproducibility of methods, and that will build trust. And we need to do all of this in terms of policy and partnerships. So those elements drive what we talk about. And I'm now delighted to really begin this session and hand over to Ana Hidalgo Simon, and apologies for my pronunciation, Anna. Anna has a great experience for many years working at the European Medicines Agency, and she's now Associate Professor at Leiden University. Anna, the floor is yours. We might just need to take Anna off mute.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides, and thank you for the very nice introduction invitation. So I am going to try to put a little bit into context what is that connection between the ATMP and the real world evidence. And as I firmly believe that this is very much part of the solution, I'm just going to give you the elements that led me to have such a strong belief. So let's start saying, what are the ATMPs? And as you all know, they are composed, delivered, formed by large cells. So we are talking about a very special medicine type. So ATMP is actually an umbrella term. Advanced therapies is the shortcut that we use. And within that, you will find the gene therapy, the medicinal therapy, somatic tissue engineering, and the combines with devices. But I really do not want to spend too much time with the classification because it is a little bit outdated, I was going to say. When we put this together 20 years ago, it looked like those buckets were extremely clear. They are not. Now we have more things in between that in each of those classifications. Plus, we know that this will very probably be revised with the new pharma legislation, which is coming. We know that it doesn't match the FDA and the definition in Japan, so it's not something global. And if you really have a question about, is my product in this bucket or the other, you just need to go to the EMA classification service. It's free, it's wonderful, and then you will know which are the guidelines you need to follow. But to talk about the evidence generation, it's much better to have an ATMP as an umbrella term and concentrated on which type of medicines they are. And this is a very small summary. So traditional therapies will encompass all the chemicals, the small molecules, and even the biologicals like the insulins or the monoclonal antibodies. So complex, but the complexity pales into insignificant when you compare it with these advanced therapies, which are really huge and very complex to do. So they are very difficult to copy. They normally should be given only once or twice. So they are not a chronic treatment. They are a one-off solution, hopefully curative in many cases. You cannot take them away. If the gene is editing, that's done. You cannot deliver them even in small hospitals. They're normally concentrated in one big place with all the SOPs, all the training, all the facilities, all the additional drugs that will need to be there in place just in case there is some reaction or some side effect. So as a consequence of all that, you can imagine that they are very expensive. We're talking here $1 million plus per patient, so nothing trivial. And that has the consequence of the other two elements. The HTAs need to really struggle with this to understand and to assess, because the consequences of reimbursement are very, very high. And that also means that as soon as we move out of the orphan domains, paying $1 million per treatment will make it very, very difficult for the health systems to be sustainable. So this societal, how do we fit with what we have, is one problem also that needs to be considered. So this is the current state of affairs. This is all the approved therapies. All these medicines got the marketing authorization from the European Medicines Agency. So a couple of things, a part of familiar names for all of you, I imagine. The gene therapy medicinal products are the ones winning. So they have more approved. And we also know that they are the most numerous in the pipeline and the clinical trials going on together. So at the moment, within the classification, the gene therapies are taking the spotlight. And the other thing to notice here is that more than 1/4 are now out of the market. So all the ones with the gray box, they are not available for patients anymore. They were approved, they were in the market, and they are off now. This is because the companies actually withdraw, or when the renewal arrives, they just don't apply for a renewal. So the final situation here is that the patients cannot use it, even though they work. So some of them are the very older one, but some of them are a little bit more recent. So this is not a minor problem. And the sad part for us is that some of those are very complex, difficult to approve medicines. There is a lot of effort put in the system, and now they are not. And the reasons are always commercial. There is no safety scares here. It's that the company commercializing those medicines was not making money and decided that it was not worth keeping them in the market. So let's look at how they are approved. And this is just a selection of them, but you can see that quite a few of them are orphan. But the majority of them still got a full marketing authorization. This is unusual because the evidence for these drugs is nothing to do with the small molecules that we were talking about. You know, randomized controlled trials with blind controls and thousands of patients. This is not the case. These drugs do not go that way. But still, they are getting a full marketing authorization, which means that the analysis and the scrutiny of the evidence by part of the regulators has to be extremely strong. And this is the complementary part of that. You can see first that the clear-cut phase 1, 2, and 3 doesn't apply here. There is a lot of merging of the phases and a lot of unusual clinical trials and a lot of innovation in the way that we test these medicines. But also look at the ticks, non-randomized, non-controlled, historical controls, intermediate endpoints, and finally the numbers. There are many medicines up there with a marketing authorization, most of them full, with double digits. So we are not talking here about regulators who are staying in the old order and demanding the same thing for all the drugs. This is very much adaptation to what the therapies require. But then we arrive to the problem of the access. So we want these drugs for every patient who needs it, but they are very expensive to make. They are supposed to be one-off, but we don't have a lifetime experience. We only have few months, years. It's difficult to prove what is the benefit. This is a criticism of the HTA. You tell me it is forever and you give me 2 years. Absolutely true. This is the evidence that we have of approval. And then we have this idea, okay, we can try to make this cheaper, but how cheaper can this go? This is very complex. And what are we going to do with those few medicines who either work or they are really worth pursuing because they may well work, but they have no profit? How are we going to take them to the market? If they were cheap to make, somebody will jump into the rescue, but they are so expensive that that is unlikely to happen. So the sustainability of the system is it's the same idea that came back to it, to see this needs to work for everybody long term. So we have 2 bridges to build. The early one is because most of the early developments of these therapies are in academic hands. And with that, I mean universities, clinical hospitals, research centers, not the companies. And the companies are the ones who have the resources and the know-how to cross that first bridge into the first humans. And the second one is the access. We may get them to the market, but we don't want them in the market. We want them in the patients. And we have that very difficult bridge with the HTAs, the assessment, the value, and the reimbursements. So we have these 2 decision makers. And the thing is that they are going to be looking at the same evidence at the beginning. The reason for that is because every bit of evidence that you produce for regulators will be looked at, should be looked at by the HTAs. Of course, they will also be looking at many other things, but you need to think that every little bit of evidence from day one need to serve those 2 decision makers. So regulators are asking the question, is this benefit risk positive in at least one set of the population? So they will be balancing all these clinical effects and the side effects and consider the uncertainty on those decisions. But then the payers and the HTAs, they're going to say how much better this is to what I already have. And what I already have is all of the medicines and surgery and prevention and palliation and whatever. They need to put it all together. So we are in a situation in which similar evidence, or at least the evidence, need to be shared, but the decisions are very different. Two things will help. The first one is this conversation between regulators and HTA and payers, which have started. Not perfect. It's something relatively recent in years' time. It's much better than it was. But it's not an easy conversation, first, because they are coming from very different points of view. And second, because it's not one-to-one. It's one-to-many. And a lot of the HTAs and the payers ask for different things, and they need to talk to each other. So this conversation makes progress slowly because it's a difficult one. And the second thing that may help and will help is the real-world evidence. So how and from where can we get more solid evidence to help reduce the uncertainty for these decisions? So the conversations out there about how we are going to make them better, these are my selection of the hot topics at the moment. So everybody's talking about platforms like a cell line or a viral vector that is regulatory approved. So the next developer doesn't have to start from zero, can start from that slightly raised platform. This streamline, everybody's looking for ways to make this cheaper, more consistent, more regular. Any automatization that we can find, anything that can be done, we just want the consistent production of products as cheap as possible. Now, the involvement of the patients, we will hear more about that, but it's super important because we really want to know what is needed at the other end. This is too expensive and too complicated to arrive there and find that this is not what it was needed at that time in that disease, in that situation. And the alternative pathways are referring a little bit to that question that I posed before. We have some non-profit but useful drugs, and we still need to move them away, getting to the patients. So the one that everybody will arrive here is that the better use of real-world data and real-world evidence is certainly one of the, for me, the one of this list who is going to deliver the goods earlier and in larger amounts. So we have this uncertainty, and on one hand, we have the regulators who have this dilemma of the high expectation and the enormous risks, limited data, but a very good willingness to take decisions, because otherwise we will not have the 25 that I saw you in there. So the regulators are willing to make the effort, but they need as many reassurance and data as we can get. And this is where we came in. We also know that the HTAs are very keen on finding real-world data for the obvious reasons. And we also have seen that the traditional way of having a lot of certainty on approval is not going to work here. We're not going to have placebo-controlled ATMP trials. So we are already using real-world evidence. Pharmacoepi in pharmacovigilance have been using for a long time, and we used to evaluate how safe and how well they work to continue proving the effectiveness. And mainly, we use it to fill the gaps. And that's why there are rich pickings here. There are a lot of gaps. Let's see how many we can continue filling to make this better. So I'm putting together the three things that I would like to revisit in the debate, and I hope that all my panelists are going to be able to provide all the answers. So it's the when, the what, and the where. The when, as early as possible. Again, check with HTAs and with regulators before you start investing masses if with the evidence that you are planning to produce is going to help the decision-making. Regulatory decision-making is a complicated issue. Don't assume that you know what is the data. If you can check, and there is plenty of opportunities to check with conference, with papers, with scientific advices, with ITFs, with interactions, with the scientific advices at the national levels. So as far as possible, earlier, please. Then what? Okay, what are we going to collect? You always talk about the compatibility of the sources, how solid are the data, how solid is the methodology, can we share? And just remember that it is more than one group that's going to be looking at this. And then the where, well, I go back to the academics, because not just that they are the ones doing the early part of the research for ATMP, it's also that they are the holders of a lot of these databases. I'm thinking just in hospital, universities, they have lots of this information, especially when they have been doing research on this for a long time. And at the moment, the burden of the data collection is also a problem. I was talking with some Dutch medics last week, and they were telling me that every time that they put a CAR T cell in a patient, they needed to fill 3 registries information with a slightly different systems and a slightly different type of information for the hospital, for the national registry, for the post-authorizations commitment for the company. The healthcare professionals are the ones who feel they have less time for that, and we are putting on them the burden. That's something that we need to look at. And again, with academics, what is to publish? What is the data protection? So for the discussion later on, I'm just putting the summary big view in 4 buckets. So first, at the moment, there is a lot of uncertainty at the point of marketing authorization, but we are getting approvals. So we need to provide more because we will need a lot more approvals than the ones that we are having at the moment. But we know what we are going to do there, because it's a question of having those stakeholders happy. And they must be happy with something because we are having some approvals. Now, the HTAs and the PAs are less happy because they are being far more reluctant. And this is linked to the high price as well. They obviously need a lot more evidence that they have. Then the post-marketing authorization, with these therapies, you cannot wait until you are about to be approved to start thinking of the post-data collection. They are an essential part of the approval process. So to have a plan from the very beginning of what, where, and how you are going to collect, how are you going to analyze it, and what information are you going to get from there for the decisions that need to be taken is fundamental. And then finally, the long-term uncertainties. And here we put everybody's benefit, because not just the renewals and the pharmacovigilance and the post-authorization commitment, we also need to know the value for society. And that will also affect the price and the way that these therapies are delivered and they are paid for. So the top line is that real-world evidence has a role in those 4 elements. And in many instances, it may be the best approach. Thank you.
Excellent. And thank you, Anna. That definitely got me thinking and appreciating the tensions that naturally exist in the ATMP processes between the costs and the value, the risks and the demand, and how do we pull all these aspects together, and to what extent real world evidence can really help provide some insight and guidance in that. Right? In full transparency, my role at the OECD is very much focused on health data and health data governance. And so your story from the Netherlands, people having to do triple key entry in order to actually keep all the systems up to date, is both a major challenge and frankly a major headache for many systems, because frankly the technologies were not designed with the data in mind. And I think that the revolution and the evolution that we actually have before us is how can we be systemically creating real world evidence as part of various clinical processes in of themselves, to let the data flow more freely and availably in order to help out our work around AMTP. But having said that, that's my 2 cents, but I'm really fascinated to hear about what the panel's got to say about it. So I think it's time to go to them. So let me spend a couple of minutes talking about who the panel is that we have with us today. We have some excellent leading thinkers in this space. Obviously, we have Alexander Natz, who joins us from the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs. We have Nicolas Hedberg from not just the role of the Swedish Dental and Pharmaceuticals Benefits, but also the overall co-chair of the HTA Coordination Group. We're joined by Christoph Ruprecht, who's the head of the Department of Health Policy and Economics, near and dear to my heart, from Germany. And then, well, there's a possibly most important, and maybe I'm a little bit biased here. We have Simone Boselli, who is the Public Affairs Director for Rare Diseases Europe, and really representing the perspectives of patients and the public at this panel. I say that is really critical, because the role of the public, we can never lose sight of the fact of why we're doing this, why we're creating data, why we're actually sharing data amongst ourselves to actually support the uses of these things is fundamentally for the public. And so I'll be really interested to hear their perspectives. But having said that, enough from me. I think what's actually most important is to listen to the speakers' perspectives. And so I'm going to start off by asking each of the panelists a question to just simply reflect on what Anna was talking about. What do you see from your perspective across insurers and industry and HTA bodies and the patients and the public writ large? What do you see as the future for the use of real-world evidence to help out or work with advanced therapeutics? And as you think about that future, you'll undoubtedly spy some potential barriers that are in our way. And so highlighting some case studies that can actually highlight how we can overcome some of those barriers will be particularly useful. So that's like really get your thinking caps on where we're going. And with that, I'm going to start with Alexander and see what we've got to say from the perspective of our pharmaceutical entrepreneurs. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's a great pleasure to be here. And yes, I mean, reflecting on what Anna said, there is very much I would agree with. First of all, I think in the field of real-world evidence, we have seen tremendous developments over the last 10 years. I think, as we've heard, we started off with a regulatory level in post-authorization safety and efficacy studies to structure things a bit more in the regulatory setting, how we could use real-world evidence. But now, more and more, we are moving into a space where we're using it also for pricing and reimbursement decision-making, and that all needs to be in an ideal scenario, and I know that's not always easy, that should be aligned if possible. But let me, first of all, start with a couple of reflections on lessons learned from real-world evidence. I mean, 2.5 years ago, we've been in the midst of the pandemic, and I think in that space, in that time, we have learned a lot from the usage of the vaccines in Israel, when we had 3 alternatives in the market, and Israel was quite a bit advanced in terms of rolling out vaccination campaigns and the vaccinations. We have very much been looking at Israel. How many vaccinations do we need? What is the right vaccination for what type of patient population, and so on and so forth. So I think that is one example where we have learned a lot, and that's certainly not in the rare disease space, but it's not to be forgotten that we have learned a lot and that we have factored real-world evidence into our decision-making at various levels. But let me turn to ATMPs, and the ATMPs, I think it's 27 ATMPs, which we have seen authorized by the European Medicines Agency over the last couple of 15 years. I think, especially when it comes to ATMPs, it's incredibly important that we use real-world evidence in the right way. And when I say using real-world evidence in the right way, it is important that we use it to generate quality data. When we speak about real-world evidence, we speak about data which is answering a very concrete question, and that question usually is spelled out or identified by the HTA bodies or by the payers. And especially when it comes to ATMPs, there is always that question of long-term effects, durability of effects. We've seen that in the CAR-Ts, we've seen it in SMA, we've seen it in multiple indications with the ATMPs. Yes, we all know that there is a potential for a long-term or even lifelong effect, but we don't know yet, when we have to make the decisions about price, what's the duration of effect. And I think we in industry, and I think we have done that, we need to understand the dilemma some HTAs and payers are in. And we appreciate the fact that rather than saying no, because the data package is not compelling enough, the size of the patient population in the clinical trial is not big enough, we are appreciating very much the fact that there is a willingness in many healthcare systems to look at those long-term effects on the basis of real-world evidence. And really, it is very important that there is a willingness, and I would like to emphasize that, on behalf of the industry, to factor in real-world evidence, and that no one is really talking about real-world evidence in terms of replacing RCT data. We should always aim at the highest possible level of data which we can bring to the table at time of launch. But rather than saying no, we should not foreclose our eyes in these decision-making processes towards future developments to really measure the long-term effect. Because we have seen situations where the trials were quite small, but where over the first 2 years, when the product has been rolled out, the ATMP has been rolled out to a wider patient population, that we have actually seen, yeah, that is a good product. It works, and patients, it helps patients in their diseases. So I just wanted to make a bit of a plea here to say, like, let's work all together to use real-world evidence in these decision makings. A plea to say, let's aim at the best quality level we could generate with real-world evidence, but let's be open-minded to factor that into decision making in terms of supplementing the data which is at the table at the time of launch, when the product is rolled out to a wider patient population. Especially that is very important in rare diseases. And I think Anna mentioned another very important point: quality of life data to be generated from the perspective of patients over the lifespan of a product, of a medicine, is also very valuable for decision making, for pricing and reimbursement decisions. So we hope that real-world evidence, although not replacing the standard methodologies of data generation or the standard tools for data generation in health technology assessment processes, not replacing them, but that that real-world evidence is also factored in a bit more into the discussion in the EU HTA implementation phase, although I know there is a clear hierarchy in terms of what is on the table when we bring a product. One last element I would like to focus on is very briefly outcome-based agreements. In my opinion, that's the second element which is especially important to bridge that time gap in terms of long-term effects for ATMPs. So it's really important that we also factor in outcome-based agreements when it comes to ATMPs to hedge the risk of the payers, if I may say, to make sure that there is rather a yes than a no at time of launch of a medicine. I think these two vehicles, real-world evidence generation on the basis of robust data, on the basis of a concrete question asked by the payer or the HTA body, and secondly, outcome-based agreements. I think these are very important tools when it comes to access to ATMPs in the future, because let's not forget about the fact that we have seen a proof of concept over the last 8 years of ATMPs in oncology indications, in SMA, but I think there is more at the horizon. We have 2,400 clinical trials globally in ATMPs, and we have much bigger diseases like Parkinson's, where we in the future could see potential solutions in the cell and gene therapy space or tissue engineering space. So let's be open-minded for innovation, and let's use those vehicles which are on the table, where we are currently making lots of experiences how to use them.
Wow, thank you very, very much, Alexander. I think that's fantastic, and highlighting the importance for I'll say collaborative risk management across the developers and the consumers and the payers. So that way there's actually, we're all trying to achieve the same thing, and how do we effectively manage everyone's risk in an effective way while we're laser focused on achieving our outcomes of better health outcomes for people. And one of the interesting areas that I think I'll explore later on are some of the challenges of doing some of these HTA work when we're trying to gather data across borders and bring that information together. Because if we want quality data, it's fine to do that within a large enough population, within several tens of millions of people. But for some of the smaller communities in Europe, populations are fairly small. So pooling information is absolutely essential, which we can talk about as we go through the panel. But for now, I'm going to move that, and actually I'm going to go over to Nicholas to talk about their perspective from the HTA's bodies.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks for inviting me. And I do have 2 different hats. As you said, Eric, I am both the co-chair of the coordination group under the new regulation, but I'm also the chief pharmacist at TLV. And for a number of reasons, I will talk more from the national perspective. And that is because on the European level, we have just seen how UNESTA 21 has delivered a number of suggestions, can I put it that way, a number of deliverable documents that are now going into the work of the subgroups of the coordination group. And the whole idea is that the coordination group will have to decide how and how much to use. But I think one thing, though, is probably in common with what I'm going to tell about the Swedish experience and the general intention in the European system. We know that ATMPs is a special category of products. We know that there will come others. We don't aim, especially for TLV now, we don't aim to build a separate system for each category of products. We try to build a system that will be fit for purpose for the whole bulk of products. And there will be special features with special products. We are aware of that, but we don't think it's possible to build different systems. I'm going to agree also to a lot of what Anna has said in her presentation, and now back on the national level, this has been a challenge for us for several years. You can follow back and you can track back. You can look at the Swedish government that has provided us with at least now 3 special assignments or commissioned us 3 special tasks based on the ATMP. Each time we have said that we're going to do this for you on ATMPs or on precision medicines, but the hardcore, the label and the pure definition isn't most important to us. It's the character that comes with these kinds of products that's going to be interesting. And we've heard a number of those already. I will talk a lot about uncertainty, the need for agreements, market managed agreements, and follow up and real world data, of course. But I must also already now say that when we look to the list of products that Anna showed us, the main reason, if they have not come to the market in Sweden, the main reason is not that TLV has said that the data quality or the effectiveness or the studies are not enough, but the price is too high. I do recognize that is connected somehow, but I would argue on the national level in the decision making, it hasn't been the uncertainty that has been the main deal breaker. Now, looking into the 3 governmental reports we have made, they are all on the website. Not all have even a summary in English, but some have. The first one was even called, "How shall we assess? How shall we pay?" That's the title of the report. We talk about the combination products and the special challenges with those, including combinations with diagnostics. How do you separate the value between different parts of the combination? We talk about the intangible utilities, so the patient outcomes that are relevant but very difficult to measure. We talk about the evidence gaps and the precision conundrum, because with precision medicines, the decision precision doesn't get better. It gets more often larger, and the uncertainties are very difficult to handle. We talk about handling of uncertainties. We talk about the importance of trying out outcome-based agreements of different kinds. Especially important to think of how to create those agreements when it is one-off treatments. We have the cost in one portion and then have to rely on long-term effectiveness. We talk about the importance of fair costs. In the second report, we keep on talking about the uncertainty. We talk about irreversible effects, disease effects. Must we accept even higher uncertainty for those that create diseases that create irreversible health losses if we are going to wait for better evidence? We talk a lot about long-term effectiveness. We state once again, we should really work with outcome-based agreements and the data capture. We even provide a simulation tool for those that enter into those agreements and want help to follow them up. We say that the cost should actually also depend somehow on the size of the patient population. So we'll never leave the cost aspect. We talk a lot about quality of life in carers. So we take one step further on these intangible utilities. And only last week, 2 weeks ago, we presented the third report. And there we talk about the importance of coming together between HTAs and payers to build knowledge together and improve our capacity. We push for the right for us to provide more support for the payers when then they want to go in outcome-based agreements. We provided the 2.0 version of the simulation tool, and we say that we must also improve the legal challenges and situations when it comes to pricing of combination therapies. We also present a literature study performed by the other Swedish HTA body, SBU, where I think a lot of people would have guessed that, but when they can say that the literature and the evidence for long-term effects is very, very poor so far. So that is somewhere where we are. We take this very seriously. We look at a number of solutions, but the uncertainty and the costs are still main challenges. Thank you.
Again, wow. Thank you very much, Nicholas. I'm obviously seeing a lot of commonality across all the things we've heard so far, the importance of outcome-based agreements, the importance of quality data, the importance of recognizing uncertainty and not being afraid of it and addressing it head on. I think these are all things that are incredibly important, and having a judicious approach and a fair approach to addressing those uncertainties and risks. Nevertheless, we shall continue our little tour. And speaking of uncertainty, oddly, I think it's an appropriate segue to talk to Christoph Ruprecht about the insurer perspective.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment briefly. An essential starting point is the drastically increasing pace of change in human history. The accelerating rate of change is particularly evident in research and development, owing to the current concentration of science. In other words, the vast majority of scientists who have ever lived are alive today. It's a golden age for the pharmaceutical industry with respect to research and development. For example, the development of CRISPR as a genome editing tool in 2013 is an accomplishment that earned Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Carpentier the 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. In the realm of creating new medical therapies, 10 years may not be a long time, but CRISPR-based therapies have made remarkable advancement. The clinical CRISPR ecosystem is exceptionally potent. Clinical trials have taken place not only for sickle cell disease or transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia, but also for CAR T cells, such as lymphomas, liver congenital amaurosis, type 1 diabetes, urinary tract infection, hereditary transthyretin amyloidosis, hereditary angioedema, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or custom cardiovascular diseases. The high pace of changes poses specific demands on innovation, management, and the quality assured introduction of new pharmaceuticals. The rapid pace also underscores the discussed reduction of the patent duration at the European level. Does not appear particularly sensible. However, the goal of making new pharmaceutical or ATMPs available in all European countries is a valid one. We should further integrate diagnostic pharmaceuticals stronger. Typically, diagnostic exhibit a significantly faster innovation rate than drug development. Diagnostic or tumor platforms linked with AI will offer new avenues for action. In Europe, 30 million people live with rare diseases. Rare diseases are not rare and by no means isolated cases, but a lived reality for a significant portion of society. Reduce the burden on patients and European citizens, making either faster and better. The high pace of innovation necessitates that the medicine reach patients without significant delays. Therefore, we need a structure of center of excellence distributed across Europe. Therefore, we need a broad European network of competence and innovation center that will also serve as places for the quality assured introduction of innovations. The rapid pace of research and development should not lead us to lower our standards for the demonstrability of clinical success in pharmaceutical. Quite the opposite. We face two fundamental challenges, among others. For cell and gene therapy, it's a time horizon. For ultra-rare diseases, it's an extremely small number of patients. For comparative studies, RCTs, and potentially the time horizon. The European registry are one answer, but they might not be sufficient. Addressing the needs of patients with ultra-rare diseases present unique challenges. Uncertainties surrounding the safety and efficacy of ATMPs complicate the evaluation and the acceptance of new treatment. The difficulty lies in demonstrating both side effects and long-term effects. While outcome-based agreements may provide a short-term solution, they are not the ideal long-term approach. Science and research could contribute to improving the quality and speed of demonstrability in clinical studies. They could potentially extend to real-world evidence, so to transfer the quality more also in the real-world evidence. In the future, the validity, quality, and diversity source of data will undoubtedly increase significantly. For example, US records and so on. In the further development of methods for demonstrating clinical success, new statistical methods, procedure such as digital twins or a stronger scientific foundation of biomarkers should play a role. ATMPs and orphan drugs should be accessible across all 27 European member states. Ensuring that all European citizens have access to these innovative treatments is not only a matter of fairness, but also investment in the overall health and well-being of our continent. So the idea is, the principal idea behind is not lowering the standard, but use more intelligent the tools which we have and develop more of that.
Thank you for that reminder. One of my favorite quotes is, "The world has never moved this fast and will never move this slow ever again." And it's just a reflection of we are moving from a linear world where things were analog and paper-based, and we're moving towards a networked and exponential world, which is far more digital. And within that, how do we re-envision our processes, our data collections, our usage of information that takes advantage of that exponential world while, as you've really emphasized, Christoph, without lowering our standards, or if anything, increasing our standards, using the power that we have from these exponential capabilities that are starting to be created through digital twins, et cetera. So really, really fascinating space. So having said that, saving, again, totally biased, saving the best for last. Simone, very curious about from the public perspective about all of this work as we think about rare diseases and anything else around RWE.
Thank you very much, Eric. And the only thing that I can already say, in particular, after the great introduction that my fellow panelists have included, is that from the perspective of rare disease patients, real-world evidence presents a significant opportunity in the context of advanced therapeutic or medicinal products, because they offer a more comprehensive understanding of treatment outcomes, disease understanding, long-term safety, and quality of life improvements. In rare diseases, there are a number of challenges that perhaps people on this panel might understand very well, particularly in relation to clinical trials enrollment, the scarcity of patients, again, the lack of disease of understanding, and the heterogeneity of clinical expression. Real-world evidence has the potential to allow people living with rare diseases to actively contribute their unique experience and perspective to evidence generation, aiding in the authorization phase and the assessment of ATMPs' real-world effectiveness. This patient-centered approach should not only provide insights beyond clinical trials, but will also empower us, individuals living with rare diseases, or those that represent and advocate on behalf of people living with rare diseases such as urologists, to have a direct impact on the development and accessibility of innovative therapies, including ATMPs, ultimately improving the quality of care and outcomes for such a vulnerable population. I would actually like to underline, as I read from Nicholas, your recent report, where you have indicated the willingness perhaps to change threshold from the from ICER in inverse relation to the prevalence. And I think that allows us to also tackle the equity of access to those therapies, particularly for very small population. And I would also like to point the finger of some of the critical points that could be approached if could be resolved if we take a whole of Europe approach, not only to real world evidence, but to access and development to therapies. And your quote, Eric, is very fitting now, because in the last 5 years, for example, we haven't seen so much such a speed in development of a clinical infrastructure that is the European reference network as we've never seen it before. And that's where we are building upon. Therefore, a step in velocity in the change is needed now. And what I mean with a whole of the EU approach, an infrastructure that empowers patients and allows for input for patients in the early phases of clinical development and regulatory authorization. If you look at the slides that Anna presented in terms of the development of the timings of development of rare diseases, you can clearly see that 2016 was a key milestone, and that is my own interpretation, but perhaps Anna can confirm, is the introduction of the priority medicine schemes in Europe. That important element allow for much greater iterative discussion between developers and regulators, still lacking a proper involvement of patients, but at a certain point within the scientific advice procedure, those discussions have been done. And therefore, to allow for these high quality standards and evidence generation that are needed, early dialogue with the involvement of everyone, including the patient, can lead to better development, as substantiated by EMA publication on the role of patient in scientific advice procedure, where it is indeed noted that when patients were involved, decision and opinion on clinical development were changed in half of the cases, but also had led to a higher authorization rate. Therefore, again, having patients and expressing their preferences, their experiences through real-world data and real-world, transforming that in real-world evidence is of central. It is essential, and that would require early alignment on evidence requirements, including HTA representative and payers. We need to get the quality standards available for rendering this real-world evidence acceptable. And here the work that has been done through real-world evidence for decision is of a real importance in elevating this quality. And finally, if we are to look at the Europe as a whole, it needs to be sufficiently resourced and integrated across countries. And here the last word is on interoperability. I just want to leave you with one example. When we talk about patient or disease registries that are multiplying, let's take a look at the experience in Duchenne, whereby the EuroNMD European Reference Network has set out an integration of 5 different registries, interoperable according to FAIR principle, that are collating data from diverse regions. This is possible. It is only up to, from a political perspective, us to decide whether we want to give real-world evidence a chance, because the premises for an improvement of access to ATMPs for the benefits of patients are all there.
Thank you again, Simone. That is the important reminders around the role of the public calibrating our processes to achieve outcomes for the public and embedding the public actually at the table as we're designing these processes, embedding them in the decision-making processes to make sure that things are designed to achieve the outcomes that they were intended to create in the first place. And the important reminder that if we get this right, we can actually achieve greater equity, especially not just within countries, but also across countries, across Europe and beyond. So I would say, Anna, you led the conversation with providing a pretty fantastic lay of the land about where things are at. I'm curious if you have any reflections on what you've heard so far from our four panelists.
The first reflection is how well the panel is coming from every corner but we are all focused on the same time and the same point, which is this is important, we need to get it right, and we need to work together from many points of view to make sure that it works.
Yeah, because it as another cliche for everyone, it takes a village. This is not a problem that can be solved by any one actor. It's a problem that needs all of the people at the table in order to work, make sure that all the tensions are represented and all the tensions are effectively considered when deciding achieving the quality data collections that we actually have. So one of the major themes, and I'll open this up to the panel, because I'm curious, I alluded to at the outset, one of my major reflections, and admittedly my bias is also towards data being accessible and used more effectively. Data are only useful when actually used, and they must be protected at the same time, but data that's behind walls actually have no value and are completely dormant. So we must free the data. But from that perspective, if we want to actually do work around cross-border work in HTA across Europe or beyond Europe, there are challenges from a policy perspective to enable that sharing of data, not to mention the challenges from the technical data standards that actually allow the meaningfulness of the data to be shared effectively. While there are initiatives like the European Health Data Space that serve to help some of that work forward, my question for all of you are, what are some of the advice that you would give to policymakers as they're thinking about adopting this European Health Data Space or beyond Europe's borders? What are some of the advice you would give around how to address these policy barriers and technical barriers that exist that prevent cross-border data sharing, or rather, what is the environment that would enable cross-border data collaborations on real-world evidence for HTA? Christoph?
Okay. Although I think it's really important to have the cooperation of cross-border, and I think also it makes sense to have the European Health Data Space. But the other side is what I mentioned before. You need a little bit further research. For example, if you speak about demonstrability in statistics, procedures, etc. So we need also common efforts on this. And the third thing is the quality and validity of data. So this is also important. Also, if you like to use real-world evidence or data from the real world, the validity of data plays also a key role.
Absolutely. Alexander, I see you came off mute. Yes, you want to add?
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to make a couple of reflections on what has been said before. I think it is really very important that we factor in the fact that this data is generated by physicians, actually. And it's we need to make sure that we make it as easy. I agree with Simone that if we're placing out, we're just overwhelming physicians in spreading out data sheets and so on. So I think it's really important that we're aiming at having in an ideal scenario, one set of registry, like we have it at the regulatory level with EMA. Now, if you ask different questions, that's not always possible. We understand that. That's not always possible. But on the other hand, if we have one EU HTA on the clinical part of a medicine, it should be ultimately also a goal to have one registry to complement that HTA report and so on. So I think it's really important that we work on methods of data sharing. I think the European Health Data Space is a very important step in the right direction, because I think the amendments which came in from the European Parliament are just very much looking also into real world evidence that what valuable in making Europe a more competitive and innovative territory towards other parts of the world. But it's more focused on how can we allow data sharing at the research level. I think we need to go one step beyond that, and this is what those amendments from the European Parliament do, to say, like, when the product is actually in the hands of the physicians and is used in patients, how can we generate the data and how can we make sure that we are facilitating data exchange? Again, it might not always be possible. We have to be realistic about this, because if you ask a different question, you might not come, you might not, the data which you're generating for question A might not serve the need for question 2. But we should strive at being aligned there and trying to integrate things, because I also heard from companies, but also from physicians, that it's a lot of work to set up those registries. That's not a complaint. We're an industry, as I think I made very clear, we appreciate very much the fact that there is an openness to consider this type of data. And we also know very much that it needs to robust and high quality data, that it's not a fishing expedition in terms of what type of data do I have on my table and what can I place there, what can I place towards another institution. But let's try to facilitate things. That would be my point here. I would like to make, and registries, we should do so.
Nicholas.
Yeah, thanks. First, I need to comment or explain something that Simone said. We left 2 reports to our ministry last Friday, 10 days ago. So one was on ATMPs, one was on rare diseases, and what you referred to will be in the second one. So doesn't answer straight to the link I sent, but it is also on our website, just to clarify that, to avoid mistakes. But then on this, I totally agree, of course, that EHDS is one of the best shots we have gotten in quite some time. I think we must be mindful there will be a difference between very old, robust registries that were founded on a national level and newer ones for perhaps newly identified rare diseases that are built for a joint European, pan-European scope from the beginning. They might have to be treated a bit differently. But my main message since many years is we need to work on 3 levels at the same time, I think. We need to work on the almost scientific development of new methods. So how shall we relate to uncertainty or evidence grading of unrandomized follow-up data, so that we can agree on some basic lines beforehand, before we face the data capture. Second, we need to work on the systematics, where EHDS is the best, but there needs to be much more on technical level, interoperability and so on. And third, we need to promote this and push this with pilots, because there will be so many forks down the road where we will stand and say, oops, this will take a long time. So we need the pilot to just go. I need to go. I take the right turn. Oops, it didn't work out for me. Then I'll take the left. So we need to work on 3 levels at the same time. I'm quite convinced we have to. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you all. And with that, I understand, Karen, you actually have some questions, but before I turn it over to Karen, just for the 100 people who are listening to us, after Karen's some of her Q&A, we'll open it up to the floor to questions. I see there's a bunch that are coming through the Q&A feature, so please keep those coming and we'll try to get to them as we go through the discussion. Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for this great discussion. And I'm actually going to bring in those questions, but what I'm going to do is roll some of those together. I'm thinking about the life cycle of evidence generation, because I can see there a question from Alexander Gigov, and there was an Italian question, which I think Simone may have answered. But thinking about how we can provide early advice to health technology developers who may not be our standard health technology developers. They may not be big pharma. As Alexander indicates, they may be academics. And Anna, this is an issue you addressed. So an indication in the question there that EMA has a special approach for engaging with academics. Is there something we as HTA and payers can learn from that? Do we need to get involved in very early discussions? But how do we do that, given we know there's a lack of capacity for dialogues, for joint scientific consultation? Is there a way we can be smarter about the advice we're giving? Because Alexander said, we know that there are going to be uncertainties in terms of long-term effects. We know that. So what can we do differently in the way in which we're engaging with developers to give early advice for these therapies, perhaps the ones that we know a little bit more now, like the CAR-Ts or like gene therapies in childhood rare diseases? Is there a way we can do this differently? Anybody, any thoughts on that?
Can I take a little bit of that? Because it's a very technical question for the specialists in real-world evidence. There is two elements here. One is that you may not provide the solution, but you need to indicate that they need to start finding where the data is going to be for the solution. So earlier on, you may not know what is the endpoint that you're going, but you should know who has the data of the disease that I have an interest on. And is that accessible, not accessible? Is connected if it's an orphan with the rest of Europe? Is a reference network that I can use? So the problem with these very early researchers is that they think that is a problem for us after marketing authorization, and it's not. You need to start from the beginning identifying not the perfect solution, because you're not going to find it, but at least the starting point that you can build, connect, add, and then start doing everything that Niklas say. What is the methodology, the robustness of the data? Okay, it's a starting point, but if they are not even considering what type of data and where it is, then we are not going anywhere. So at least that. But also this issue of what policy making across Europe could be thinking of. I think real-world evidence is actually a low-hanging apple. With a relative investment, you can get a lot done and a lot of benefit for medicines that have not been invented yet. But the data will be there when the time arrives. So it will be a good use of resources from my point of view.
Thank you, Anna. And I'm going to hand over to Simone, because Simone, you mentioned the potential of European reference networks. But my feeling is that HTA and payers don't have much interaction with them. What can we do to improve that situation?
So foremost, the HTA and payers should pay attention to the ERNs anyway. For example, the potential of registry-based or registries that are based within the ERNs for particular or several conditions aggregated is immense. In the sense that in a ERN like the ERN blood, you can have very serious comparison between the cost of certain difference and the treatment between different conditions across Europe. That's the same for example, in the metabolic ERNs, which is the group that has probably one of the major, the greatest number of rare diseases. And there, for example, you start encountering that the fact that the potential for these ERNs is hampered by fragmentation, even at a local level, whereby hospitals don't talk to each other in a region, whereas in another region, there is a comprehensive approach to all metabolic patients in one specific region. What treatment are they taking? How many times they are visiting the hospitals, etc., etc. That is a real potential in a nutshell, where you can really understand how a disease is evolving. What are the effects of existing treatment on a defined patient population? But this example are there. We're not taking it as a whole of EU approach. We are still skeptical in some cases that you know, the data that are produced in Germany and not sufficiently good enough in Sweden, or vice versa. Just because you, Christoph, and Nicholas are here in front of me, not for anything else. I have nothing against either countries, but there is the potential there. Tomorrow at the conference in Bilbao, that's the Spanish presidency of the EU and the European Economic and Social Committee, a focus will be on the potential of the ERNs. But again, as my previous point, also for the effective use of real-world evidence, you need to have a sufficient financial commitment or resource commitment to make it work, proportionate to the expectation that you're putting on them. If we are putting a lot of expectation on real-world evidence, we need to create the infrastructure that collates that data for the purposes that we have at hand, which is to mitigate, or maybe, using your words, Karen, make those data mature. And which is I appreciate very much, because in some situations that I've seen, particularly in recent times on the assessment of some gene therapies for very specific diseases, some countries, and I don't want to name names today, refer to the data sets provided as insufficient, other refers to them as immature. And I think that's perhaps semantic here. I don't think so. It's really important to look at the evidence as immature, as we have a plan, like you have, to raise your child. Sometimes goes off the window, but at least you have a plan to make that or lead that evidence to be mature.
Thank you, Simone. You kind of raised a challenge there, I think, for Nicholas and Christoph, and it relates to questions coming through about the potential for outcome-based agreements. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on those, because we've seen challenges in outcome-based agreements, but perhaps more successes with those for CAR-Ts, for example. But are they feasible? Christoph, a question for you about why only short-term. Hans-Georg is asking you, why only short-term agreements? Why not longer-term? Isn't it the longer-term where we've got the uncertainty? And Nicholas, a question to you about, you're a small country. Would you accept the data from France or Germany? So I'll turn to Christoph first.
Yeah, thank you for this question. The idea is not, this is a short term for 1 year or something like this. This is only if you see the high amount or number of rare diseases or personalized therapies or gene and cell therapies, then in principle, you need a new method or procedures to show the demonstrability of clinical success. That's the reason I like to speak about better foundation of biomarker. This would help for long-term or time horizon, or if you have new statistical methods, would also help. So I think we have also seen in this extension and better quality of real-world evidence data.
Thank you for that explanation, Christoph, there. And that's the importance of identifying a realistic outcome that we can measure within the clinic to inform our pricing and kind of reimbursement process. Nicholas, I'm going to go to Alexander first and then Nicholas.
I'm flexible. I wanted to raise my hand to say something on the agreement. If Nicholas wants to go first. I think there is a great potential in outcome-based agreement, especially when it comes to ATMPs. And we've been in conferences for the last 10 to 15 years, and you always have these people saying that it's never going to work because it's, and we all know it's not easy. But if you keep those agreements dedicated to certain performance or outcome endpoints, which are agreed between the company and the payer, history has shown they can actually work. We've seen it in situations where we have more than one treatment option. If I have a chronic treatment option, like in SMA, and then the gene therapy comes in second, I think many payers would request those type of agreements to showcase that there is durability of effect in the gene therapy, that there is a certain effect for 5 or 10 years of those of the gene therapy. I think we will also see it in hemophilia A more and more, where we have a similar situation with a chronic treatment option, and also with a one-time therapy. So I think the issue very much with the outcome-based agreement is about data sharing, because, for example, in Germany, we hear that GKVSV, the umbrella organization negotiating prices with pharma companies, they don't have access to all the data, which is true, and that makes it more difficult. But we have to find ways to get better in data sharing in order to allow those outcome-based agreements to, again, as I said before, hedge some risks of the payers, show that there is also a belief of the company in their product. I mean, it's a guarantee. And I think there's huge potential, especially in these situations where we have a chronic treatment option and then the gene therapy to come along. I would even go as far to say that I think many payers in many European countries would consider them, if possible in their territory, as a given therapies, a second or third or fourth products in a given indication. So I just wanted to mention that data sharing in that respect is key, because we have to observe and monitor the outcomes which we are defining between the payer and the health insurance.
And I can see that you've stimulated thought in Christoph there, so I'm going to let Christoph respond.
Okay, so the idea is not that we say outcome case contracts will not work, but if you look in the next 10 years or 5 years, then you will recognize that it's necessary to be better than this. So that's the idea behind. So we say we use also outcome-based contracts. This is not the problem. But if you see the number of diseases, so gene therapies, then you need a little bit more normal procedure to work. And I think that's possible.
Thank you, Christoph. I'm going to hand over to Nicholas now for your thoughts on the potential of outcome-based agreements.
I think it's a little of both and of all. I've been quite skeptical myself, because I think we have seen so few very good examples. They do require a tremendous amount of work from all sides. Especially we hear from the payers, but I'm sure that's true from the seller and the companies as well. And we as facilitators, because we don't enter agreements of that kind, but we try to facilitate them and have the knowledge input. And then at the end of the day, the outcome is very limited. Once again, because I know for sure at some point we haven't been able to agree on the methods afterwards. We would have needed to do that on beforehand. So we end up disagreeing on what's the relevance of these data on these results. But still, and I would say, I hope in the long run, it shouldn't matter so much where the registered data is. We will, of course, have to put some quality measures on every registry, but I hope, given that the population and especially the comparator is about the same, I'm sure we would be able to the registry must mirror the clinical situation in our country, of course. And finally, then, you heard from me telling you the goodies from our 3 reports. Obviously, when we as an agency provide suggestions for our government, we tend to land in try even harder to work with the option of some kinds of agreements based on real outcome. So we keep coming back to the outcome-based agreements as probably the best, right now, the best possible solution for future decision-making in this field. Even though we see all the both pros and cons of it, but all the work that comes with it, we still tend to say that that is probably the one we should start with, because the rest of the list of suggestions is quite short.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm going to push everybody a little bit further with a question that sort of relates to what David Epstein's saying in the questions, which is why, so you've mentioned there a problem is that it comes to the point of HTA and going into pricing and reimbursement, and there are uncertainties, and we're trying to scrabble around to identify whether there is appropriate data. Can't we work earlier to align our data collections, discuss with EMA some of the early scientific advice sessions they've been having with the developers? Let them do that, because we don't have the capacity. But let's engage with them to kind of agree what a minimum data set might be that would suit all of our decision makers' needs. Is that feasible or not? Does anybody want to have a go at that? Alexander, let me turn to the industry. Isn't that something that would be good for industry? What's stopping that?
Definitely. I think any early discussion, whether it's in the EU HTA in the regulatory setting, is of course very much appreciated from the industry perspective. I would think that we need to find an agreement to get the P&R decision makers around the table and agreeing on those, let's say, endpoints for a registry which serves the needs of the regulators and the payers. So in general terms, I would say yes, definitely. Let's have that collaborative approach, which actually we had in real-world evidence for decisions for a couple of years already now, with your support, Karen. And let's roll that out into the practice potentially. So that would be much appreciated. So I think that would be the way forward, to have early on discussions about how can we actually identify potentially some data gaps in cell and gene therapies, where I think, Anna, you've been highlighting very clearly, like these cohorts in those clinical trials are very often very small, and that might not be a big enough patient population to meet the demands of the payers. And let's work on together as soon as possible in order to fill those data gaps, to identify them, and to discuss that early on in order to generate the data.
And it's great that Anna wants to come in on this, not only as a current academic, but as a past experienced regulator. So Anna, give us your wisdom.
I hope that you're going to get the regulatory side from me and the HTA coming from Niklas next. So I don't disagree. It's good and is the way to go. I'm going to give you a little window of why it's not working as well as we will hope, which is because we are talking here about things who have major disclaimer. The first one is things change a lot in 5 and 10 years' time. You find something that you think is going to be a good measurement in 5 years, and the clinical situation has changed so much that what you agree was going to be the mark to say success or failure is not there anymore. That happens all the time. But then you have another, the way that this works is not a regulators tell industry, I want this evidence. Industry comes with evidence and regulators look at it. And then they have to decide if it's enough for what they want to, for the indication and for the population and for the target. But, okay, that is actually very difficult, because it's not that you have the completely buffet to select the ones that you want. It's that of what you get, you need to do your best to see, is this enough evidence to reassure me that this is safe and effective? One thing that is happening now is that, for example, if the company comes with a clinical scale to measure the progression of a neurological condition, we used to take it. Now, what you do with that is go into the patient's association or representative. Is this going to be a good clinical scale to tell me if this is working when it goes to the clinic and in the next 10 years? If the answer is no, it's back to the company is going to say, patients say no. So there are a lot more realistic layers coming on all the time, but it's basically a bit of a crystal ball of how you are going to measure the effectiveness of this in the future without being able to choose the evidence now.
Thank you, Anna. We all need crystal balls, but perhaps if we gaze in it together, we'll see the future. Nicholas.
Thanks. I would say if we look back, not 15 years, but 13 years to 2010-19, where we started talking about joint or parallel scientific advice, and look to where we are now, I think we have seen a tremendous conversion. It's a completely different ball game. There is still work to do, I admit that, but we must be mindful of that. I think it was Anna's first slide. We have different missions. We will ultimately always, to some extent, need answer to different questions, because we don't do the same decision making. We cannot take that away. So we must, and then I must also nudge the industry a bit, because we haven't been with the track record isn't splendid, because so many times we have heard that's a fair point, but FDA doesn't require it, or it's too expensive. And we do realize that even if we come together in Europe, we are not the most relevant threshold, to be very honest.
Thank you, Nicholas. And I'm going to let Simone comment, and then Eric's going to take on the final question for you.
Well, then I've got two very quick comments on it. What is evaluated by, and I thank Hannah for intervention, is that patient centricity starts at the very beginning, where when you start having this discussion about a potential solution for a disease in rare diseases in our community, that link between the patient community, the caregivers, the researchers, even though going further to the academia and the commercial sponsors, is very tight. And it's very comprehensive. It doesn't work all the time, but yet it's very much there. And this for this reason that I still convinced that the experience shows, in particular, not complementing what Nicholas said, in the mechanism of coordinated access, which was a pilot project coming out in 2011 out of the process on corporate responsibility of the pharmaceutical sector, and looking at specifically how early dialogues and continuous dialogue on orphan medicinal products between payers, sponsors, and patients would benefit everyone in that sense. I think there has been a lot of progress in this area, but we need to bring those dialogues that are currently being done on a pilot phases, build upon the 10 years experience that have been there, because I've seen innovative products going through that. I cannot say which one, but at least we have seen that those dialogues help everyone, as patient, making sure that our real life experience was heard, sponsored to understand what the challenges of the payers were, and payers themselves understanding how evidence could be supplied on a particular, on a given population, on a given disease, on a given treatment. And I will put it in the chat so that everyone knows what.
Thanks, Simone, that particularly important example of MOCA. Handing over to Eric for the final question.
Fantastic. So we're coming up on our time, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists in 30 seconds, what is the one thing we should focus on in the next year to improve real-world evidence for HTA for these advanced therapeutics? I'm going to start with Anna. I should have warned you, Anna.
I take the easier one then, which is this European level efforts, because whatever we achieve there will benefit most people.
Excellent. Alexander.
I take Nicholas' point. It takes all the key stakeholders around the table, including industry, to be willing to have a proper, as we call it, parallel scientific consultation to prepare for the EU HTA, to prepare for regulatory submission processes, and to prepare also for the pricing and reimbursement decisions, which are continuing after the EU HTA. Because when it comes to outcome-based agreements and many other things, it's all in the national domain, the decision-making, and the process will continue at the national level when it comes to the HTA cost-effectiveness part. So it also takes industry. Let's use the existing framework which we're having in the implementation phase, parallel scientific consultations, and so on and so forth, in the making of the EU HTA and afterwards.
Simone.
One thing. I think the adoption as a community of a whole of system approach to ATMPs, particularly for rare diseases, in the sense that with a approach that tackles all of the issues around ATMPs, from discovery to access with real-world evidence, we will have a much greater and comprehensive picture of how we can make it sustainable in the future.
And Christoph?
A combination of measures, including European Health Data Space, validity of data, and other tools.
Nicholas?
And I will cut the cake from another perspective. You must make sure to pick a case where, if let's say the problem is that reimbursement agencies won't give reimbursement or payers won't pay, then you must realize that there is difference if they say the uncertainty is too high or the price is too high. It might also be a combination, but you must find those which actually our decision breaker is uncertainty. Then you should focus there, because more data will not help you if the problem is the price.
10 seconds, Christoph.
Okay, so I think if you look in the time horizon, it's more complicated. Not only the duration of the therapy, we have also new incoming therapies, and this changed also your pricing, which you like to have perhaps in future. So you have a broader discussion. Also, if you have a peak population, then you have to speak about capitation or something like that. So I think if you look in direction of negotiation, the picture is more complicated.
Thank you, Christoph. And this is indeed a complicated topic, but I think what we've heard here today is that for ATMPs, we will need robust real-world evidence. We need to develop it together, and we need to gaze in that crystal ball to try and determine what will be needed and perhaps work in new and innovative ways. I'd like to thank Eric for co-moderating this so superbly with me, to Anna for a wonderful keynote speech, and to our 4 panelists for your really great interactions with one another. Thank you all very much. And you can see in the chat that you can follow us on our website, and there will be a report of this session made available with the recording, which you can share with all your colleagues. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.